Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar plan for today, which is an introduction to the Environmental Farm Plan. My name is Taya Green, and I'm the Program Manager at Keystone Agricultural Producers, CAP, and I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter today, Andrea Bertholet from Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. Andrea is going to take us through an introduction to the Environmental Farm Plan today, and we would welcome questions at the end that Andrea will answer. If you could please type your questions in as they come up throughout the webinar, I'll hold on to them and ask them directly to Andrea at the end. I'm going to pass it over to Andrea now, and thank you so much, Andrea, for your willingness to present this information to Manitoba farmers.
Thanks for that intro, Taya. So as Taya said, my name is Andrea Bertholet and I'm with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. I look after the Environmental Farm Plan, delivery of the Environmental Farm Plan here in Manitoba. So today I'm going to give an overview of the Environmental Farm Plan program. So I'm going to start off with what is an EFP. Basically, an environmental farm plan is a voluntary self-assessment of a producer's own farm or ranch, and it's delivered in partnership with CAP, as Taya said. It is designed to help farm managers identify environmental assets and risks on their operations and develop an action plan to reduce any identified risks. It is a federal provincial government initiative offered under the Canadian Agriculture Partnership, or CAP. The Environmental Farm Plan has been around for a while. It began in Manitoba in 2005 under the previous frameworks of APF, then Growing Forward 1 and Growing Forward 2. So the CAP partnership will run until the fiscal year of 2022-23. Who can participate in the Environmental Farm Plan? Basically, anyone, an individual, partnership, or incorporated entity under the laws of Canada or Manitoba. You must own, rent, lease, manage, or otherwise control agriculture land used for the production of agricultural products. So basically, you must be farming or owning farm land. So as we mentioned, Keystone Agricultural Producers is involved, partners with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development in the delivery of the Environmental Farm Plan. So CAP is Manitoba's general farm policy organization. They are the ones that contract the reviewers to conduct the review step of the EFP process, and this helps maintain an unbiased review of the EFP that is completed by farmers. CAP also then issues the Statement of Completion that is valid for 5 years and manages all the Statement of Completion data. So all of the statistical data, producer information is all stored at CAP, not with the government. So they kind of hold the third-party component of the EFP process. So here's an overview of how you can get an environmental farm plan, what it would take. So the first step is to attend a workshop. So the workshop is typically 2 to 3 hours, and at that workshop you will receive your workbook, which is a binder that is the self-assessment. At the workshop, we will go through section A of the workbook and complete most of it. You may not fully get it done, but you'll get it pretty close to being completed. Then we'll get started on section B, which is the assessment component, and then section C is where you develop your action plan. We'll get started on that, kind of give you an overview of how it's all set up and how it works. And then the next step is you take that workbook home and you finish section B and section C in full. Once that is completed, the next step is the review process, which I mentioned is done through CAP. So you have to make an appointment with either a specific reviewer. There's 5 reviewers in the province right now, and at the workshop you would be given their contact information, or you can contact the CAP office directly to set up an appointment with the nearest reviewer to you. Once that review is complete and the reviewer has completed the checklist they need to, the CAP office will issue you your Statement of Completion, and it'll be sent directly to you. And that Statement of Completion is valid for 5 years. So that's an overview of the EFP process of how to get one. When that 5 years is up, or when your Statement of Completion expires, you would come through this process again and update your information as needed.
why participate in the environmental farm plan? So why would you go through the self-assessment and do this? The number one driver of the environmental farm plan program historically has been program opportunities. So in order to be eligible to apply for certain activities and programs, you are required to have a valid environmental farm plan statement of completion. So some of those programs that are currently offered are under Ag Action Manitoba, so the Assurance BMPs, as well as the Watershed EG&S BMPs. There are a few other programs that are up and coming, such as GROW and the Conservation Trust. There's some funding allocated there that is linked to the EFP as well. The second reason to participate in the EFP would be intrinsic value or personal benefits. Anytime you do a self-assessment, there's personal benefits, whether it be an environmental self-assessment such as this or a business risk management self-assessment. There's opportunity there for you to make small changes on your operation that can benefit you in the future. And then the third reason would be market or sustainable sourcing requirements, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about now as well. There are certain commodities and markets that are requiring some sort of sustainability protocol, and a few of them have chosen the environmental farm plan to meet those requirements or those standards. So there are a couple industry-specific chapters that can be added into your EFP. The first is the potato production chapter. So since about 2010, McDonald's requested that their suppliers, McCain's, Simplot, and Cavendish, prove that they were producing potatoes in a sustainable fashion. So Manitoba Agriculture at the time worked with McCain's to develop the potato production chapter to ensure that the content meets all of their standards. So any potato producers in Manitoba are required to have a valid EFP in order to qualify for a contract with McCain's, Simplot, or Cavendish. And so that has been going on since 2010. A more recent marketing requirement would be the field pea production chapter that was developed in 2018. Since Roquette's pea processing plant is being built in Portage, they are wanting to meet some global sustainability standards as well and have chosen the EFP to do that. So in order to contract field peas with Roquette, producers are required to have a valid environmental farm plan statement of completion as well. So these two chapters are not part of the standard EFP workbook. So if you are interested or need them for those contracting, you do have to request them when you register for a workshop, and then they can be added into your workbook. There are similar initiatives emerging in other commodities as well. In particular is in the dairy industry, their ProAction initiative for the environmental pillar of ProAction. They are using the environmental farm plan as meeting that requirement. So dairy producers in Manitoba will be required to have a valid environmental farm plan in the coming years. All this relates back to sustainable sourcing. So sustainability, there's three pillars of sustainability, one being the environmental pillar and then economic and social. So when those three pillars are taken into account in decisions, that's when we get sustainability. So the environmental farm plan is one way that we can meet that environmental pillar, and it checks off a couple of the economic and social boxes as well. And so it's a good supplement to some sustainable sourcing protocols. Historically, Canada has relied on our reputation as a clean, safe place to produce food. However, consumers are increasingly demanding proof that our production practices are sustainable, so safe, clean, and humane. As farmers, we are stewards of the land. We know where we take care of the land. It is our livelihood. But this is one way that farmers can do their due diligence to show that their practices are sustainable. So as I mentioned earlier, the Environmental Farm Plan is a national initiative. However, each province developed and delivers their EFP programs somewhat differently. So there is a national steering committee that helps to align all the regional EFPs to a common standard and baseline standard. We're seeing more of this being a necessity as there are more global sustainable sourcing coming. One example is the pea processing plant Roquette here in Manitoba. They're going to be sourcing some peas out of Saskatchewan as well. So just ensuring that the Saskatchewan EFP content is equivalent and meets those requirements as well, so that producers don't have to have two EFPs. The EFP in their province does meet those requirements. So there is that national level of planning here as well. So that's kind of the big picture of how the environmental farm plan can fit into sustainability, sustainable sourcing, marketing requirements, that sort of thing. It's kind of one tool that can check off a few opportunities and a few boxes for producers without having them to do the same type of work, time, paperwork for multiple contracts and things like that. So next I'm going to do a quick overview of what an EFP workshop would look like, what we would talk about in a workshop. So the first part of the workshop would be an introduction to environmental farm planning, kind of what I just talked about, maybe a little more elaborative at the workshop. Then we'll get into the workbook itself. So as I mentioned, there's 3 sections. Section A, where we look at natural and introduced assets and risks on your farm. Then section B is the management review. Section C is where we do your action plan. And then that'll wrap up the workbook part. We'll do a quick overview of the review process, what you can expect when you meet with your CAP reviewer. Then we'll do an overview of the available BMP programming. And at the end, there's an optional AgriMaps tutorial that we offer for producers that want to stay for an extra 5 or 10 minutes. We show them how to use the AgriMaps tool on the Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development website. So Section A. Section A, we start off looking at the Farmstead review. So this is where we focus on your yard sites. So your yard sites are point source contamination. So you've got a small amount of acres, but a large amount of potential contaminants. So we want to quantify and address the situation on your yard sites. So an example of an asset or a good thing in your yard would you've got a properly designed pesticide storage unit that's at least 100 meters from a water feature. That's a good thing, that's an asset. On the other end of the spectrum, if your pesticide storage is on a steeply sloped and compacted surface that leads directly to a creek, that is a higher risk. So those are kind of an example of the type of thing that we would look at when we look at your yard sites. So here's what table 1 looks like. We list out all of your yards. So if you just have 1 yard on your farm, then you just list out your 1 yard. If you've got 2 or 3 yards or more, you want to list them all out. So we want to identify what your water sources are, what the drainage is like in your yard, the slope, the depth to water table, and then we determine from those categories or those categorizations, we determine what your potential for runoff is and what your potential for groundwater contamination is. So then in one quick look, we've got a summary of the environmental components of your yard sites on your farm. There's 2 tables after that we fill out that have to do with your yard site. So one is your water requirements table. We do a quick assessment, estimation of the maximum water, potential water that could be used on your farm. And then we do a similar table to this to quantify your animal units on your operation as well. And then the last part of the yard site review would be a yard site sketch. So you can either use an aerial photo or you can do a hand-drawn sketch on grid paper that's provided. Basically here we want to identify any infrastructure in your yard and potential hazards. So having an idea where your pesticides are stored, if you've got any fertilizer, fuel storage, confined livestock areas, your barn, and then where the water sources are in your yard. You could also take it to the next step and add in where hydro lines are, phone lines, buried water lines, anything like that. So it could be used as a safety tool as well. Once we're done with the yard site review, we move on to the field review. This is where we're going to focus on your crop and pasture land. This is non-point source contamination that we're thinking about, so a large amount of acres, but a relatively small amount of potential contaminant. So we're going to look at different things. So an example of an asset on your field would be you have a light textured soil, but you keep it under perennial cover. So you know you've got a risk for erosion. That's why it's under perennial cover. That's an asset. That's a good thing. The other end of the spectrum would be you have that light texture soil, but it's under low residue annual crop or summer fallow. That would be on the other end a high risk for potential erosion. With the field review, we talk a lot about egg capability. So if you've never heard of egg capability, don't worry. We talk about it in a lot of detail in the workshop. We go through what egg capability is, how it's used. The biggest take home is that we want to think about the limitations on the soil. So there's different limitations on every field, and with that limitation comes an environmental risk. So In the workbook, we have a table that looks like this. We're going to list out all of your fields, quantify the number of acres on each field, and then the big take-home message out of this one is identify what limitations are on each of your fields and start thinking about what is the environmental risk with those limitations on each field. And then that would wrap up section A of the workbook, and we basically get that done in the workshop. So next we move on to section B. Section B is broken into multiple chapters. The first group of chapters are based on your yard site. The second half is your field type chapters, and then your additional chapters would go in here as well. So how section B works, basically it lists out a question or a statement, and then you have to read through, so the questions here, you read through the 4 possible answers. You have to read through those and determine where your management style or where your production practices on your farm would fit. And then you would put your answer here. So in this example, my potential for salinity, my crop growth and yield are affected by salinity on my farm. So I put a 3 there. That would be my answer. And because it's a 3 or a 4, I would have to make an action plan when I get to section C on this part. So it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of chapters and a lot of questions to go through in B, but it's pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of reading and picking where your farm would fit in those 4 options. So once you're done that, section C is where we're going to make your action plan. So your action plan is set up in a table form like this, so don't worry, you don't have to write an essay or anything like that on your action plan. It's just a matter of filling in this table. Short sentences, point form is fine. Basically, we just want to identify what area of concern we're looking at. So in this example is fuel storage. So you had a few higher risk items in that category. We grouped them all together and assessed them here. So just because you answered a 3 or a 4 or a higher risk in a certain area doesn't mean you're not doing anything to reduce that risk. So we want to identify what are the beneficial management practices that you're already doing on your farm. So in this example, you're visually inspecting your tanks for leaks on a regular basis. Seems something small, but it is a good practice to do to reduce the risk. The next part of the action plan, we want to make a short-term and a long-term plan. So what are a few small things that you can do in the short term and then a long-term plan to ultimately reduce that risk? So we can identify those there, and then we identify what are the challenges for implementation. So what would slow down this process, or what would stop you from being able to do that? Cost and time will be 2 fairly common ones as you go on. And then the last column, you can keep this as a living document for future years. So if you do happen to complete part of or fully some of these plans, you can indicate the date and what was done in here. So hopefully in 5 years, when you come back to renew your EFP, you can have a few less action plans as time goes on. That would be the ultimate goal, would be improvement over time. So that is, in a nutshell, the workbook. A quick overview of the EFP process is the next part that we do. So the EFP review is voluntary, it's confidential, and it's one-on-one with the Keystone Agriculture Producer Reviewer, so with the CAP reviewer. The review is conducted in a neutral location, and you can schedule a review directly with CAP. If you attend a workshop, typically most workshops, we have review dates set up ahead of time with the local reviewer, and you can sign up for a date and time to meet with your reviewer. And I find that gives yourself a deadline to get the workbook completed and get it done, and move on to the next phase of getting your statement of completion in a timely fashion. So the intent of the review is to provide a supportive, credible process for all participants, assure that the action plan that you have developed will be a benefit to you and your family once implemented, and then also an opportunity to discuss how your farm contributes to a cleaner and healthier environment. Once the review is complete, the questionnaire form gets sent to the CAP office, and the CAP office will issue you your statement of completion, which will look like this. You determine what your name goes on it, and then it has an expiry date on the statement of completion. So it does expire in 5 years, so you would have to come through and renew through the workshop an updated workbook and go through the process again to update it for renewal. Then we go through an overview of available programming in Manitoba. Right now, it is offered under the Canadian Agriculture Partnership. It is called the Ag Action Manitoba Assurance BMPs and Watershed EG&S BMPs. So all the BMP information is on Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development website. And so there's multiple cost share BMPs that you do. In order to do those projects, you do have to have your EFP valid. And then the last part of the workshop is the AgriMaps tutorial. So on the Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development website, there is an aerial mapping viewer that is open to the public. Anyone can use it. There's lots of good tools in this aerial imagery. It's not just the aerial imagery, but there are multiple layers that you can select, and A capability being one of them. So we talk a lot about A capability in the workshop. You can go on to AgriMaps and put the A capability overlay on your land, and it'll show you all your A capability ratings for your land. So it can be a very useful tool in the assessment part of the EFP, and even in management decisions throughout your operation. There's other layers in there as well, such as soil classification and that sort of thing as well, that could be of benefit to you. So we do provide that as kind of a learning tool at the end of the workshop for those that are interested as well. And there is actually a YouTube video tutorial online. If anyone is interested in going and watching that, kind of shows you how to use the AgriMaps as well. So a few of the current developments in the EFP. So right now we are just beginning to work on developing an online version of the Environmental Farm Plan in Manitoba. So we're hoping to align our content to national and international standards to ensure all our content meets those requirements. By moving the EFP online, we want to increase the ease of use for clients. So producers can kind of create their username, login. They can complete the self-assessment at their own pace, on their own time, as they need. But we still want to focus on the adult education components of it. We don't want to lose that we have in the in-person workshops currently. So there's going to be some learning modules and education components that go along with it as you work through the self-assessment online. Also, with being online, the EFP we can have the opportunity to add in other modules and assessment tools such as climate change assessment, species at risk assessments, safe farms as well. So there's lots of opportunity to improve the resource that you're getting as a producer as we move online. And then ultimately that EFP workbook, it uses a lot of paper, so we would reduce paper waste by printing off paper workbooks as well. So that's kind of an exciting development that we are currently working on for the EFP, so stay tuned for that. And then to follow Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, we've got a monthly e-newsletter. We're active on Twitter. There's a 1844 line. If you do ever have any questions or inquiries, you can definitely give that number a call and can be directed to someone to help you. Yeah, and then that kind of wraps up the presentation that I have, kind of a quick nuts and bolts of the EFP program. There's my contact information on there, as well as the CAP phone number. So if you do have any further questions or want more information about the Environmental Farm Plan program in Manitoba, definitely reach out to either one of us. So with that, thank you everyone for joining. I'll pass it back over to Taya if there are any questions about the presentation, the EFP. At this time, we can answer those.
Great, Andrea. Thank you for that wonderful whirlwind tour of the process of EFP. That was a fantastic overview. I'll just remind all of our audience members that if they do have questions, they should go ahead and go to the right side of their screen and type them in, and I'll read them out loud. This is the start of our Q&A portion of the presentation, and I have a few questions for you. So I'll go ahead and ask the first one, Andrea.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about what's happening with EFP workshops and EFP reviews during COVID-19?
That is a good question. So typically, as I mentioned, our workshops were in person. Now with the current situation with COVID-19, we are no longer able to offer in-person workshops. We have been doing a few small workshops virtually by GoToMeeting. So similar to this webinar, just with smaller groups. So if you are interested in doing an EFP right now, definitely call your local Manitoba Ag office or the 1844 number, and you can get put on a waiting list. We are keeping the virtual workshops fairly small, just so that we can manage bandwidth and questions and that sort of thing as well. So we are currently offering workshops virtually, kind of on a smaller scale. If it's not necessary, or if it's not urgent that you need to get the EFP, you can definitely wait till things open up a little bit, and we may go back to doing in-person workshops at a later date. However, there is the opportunity to take part in some on GoToMeeting. Same as the review. So if you have done an EFP workshop and you've completed your workbook, you just need to get it reviewed. Definitely reach out to your CAP reviewer or the CAP office. They do have the capabilities to do reviews virtually as well, either by Zoom, FaceTime, different means depending on the reviewers. So there are those options available right now.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I've got another question for you here. What's the best way for producers to find out about when and where upcoming EFP workshops will be held? And this question is a post-COVID question. So after COVID's over, what's the best way for them to know about when and where the workshops will be?
Oh, for sure. That's a good question. So we do have a web page that lists all of the scheduled EFP workshops on the Manitoba Agriculture website. So if you go to the Manitoba Agriculture website and just search Environmental Farm Plan Workshops, it should take you right to that page. CAP also promotes, when we do have scheduled workshops, CAP promotes them through their CAP Alert, as well as on their website, I believe. Right, Taya?
Yeah, usually just through CAP Alert. We don't have a specific web page at this point in time, but we do publish it once a week in CAP Alert, the upcoming ones.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, either through there or our Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development website, or Manitoba, our Twitter account as well. We usually tweet out about that as well.
Perfect. Another question for you here, just wondering about the time investment that it would take for producers to get kind of through the workshop and then the homework and the review at the end. Do you know approximately how long it takes for an average size grain farm or an average size livestock operation to go through this process from start to finish, so producers have an idea of the time commitment?
Yeah, so it's very dependent upon the size of the operation and the commodities that are involved in the operation. You know, a simple smaller grain farm versus, you know, a mixed beef and grain farm definitely would vary. So the workshop itself is 3 hours, and then the amount of work you would have to do on the workbook, I would say would vary anywhere from 5 to 8 hours at home on your own time, I would guess. Smaller operations would be significantly less than that, but that would be a ballpark, I would guess.
Great. And then the review itself, how long does that take approximately?
So the review itself is less than an hour. So it depends on the size of the operation and the reviewer as well, but typically the review is anywhere from half an hour to an hour.
Perfect. In this webinar, you talked a little bit about the review process. Can you also talk about some of the advantages of working directly with a reviewer and some of the additional information that reviewers might be able to provide farmers with during the review process?
For sure. So the reviewer goes through the workbook and verifies that you've completed everything, but there's a lot of opportunity for conversation and questions to be asked with the reviewer. The reviewers are resources of information, so definitely ask them questions. They can ask you some questions. There's lots of value in having those conversations with the reviewer about different programming that could be available, in contact with your watershed districts, because there's programming through them as well. So yeah, there's lots of value in having conversations with those reviewers.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I have one last question here to ask, unless any more come in. The last one is, I know you talked about BMPs, otherwise known as beneficial management practices. Can you provide an example of how completing an EFP will help farmers to identify the possible BMP opportunities that are available to them?
Sure. So when a producer completes the environmental farm plan, they'll have a list of their action plan at the end. And so sometimes there's things in that action plan that can relate directly to some of the BMPs that are being offered. So that's kind of where the linkage comes with the BMPs being offered to address identified risks. So if you do have risks identified in your action plan, there may be incentive programming to help you reduce those risks on your farm. A common example of the current BMPs would be the managing livestock access to riparian areas. So if you've got a pasture that has a creek going through it and cattle currently have full access to drinking directly out of that creek, this BMP can provide some cost share funding for you to fence off that creek and put in an offsite watering system. So the watering system itself, the fencing, all of that would be eligible for the cost share under that BMP. That's just one example. I think there's 17 BMPs in total. So there's lots of other ones as well. That's just one example.
Fantastic. I just want to open it up to Lori. Lori also has a few questions from the audience to ask at this point in time.
Okay, I have one question here. Apparently there are a couple positions available at the Portage EFP workshop next week. If you want to call Tamara Watson in Portage at 204-239-3352. And then there's one more. There's one more that when is the next intake for applications for funding?
So currently, so for the BMPs for this year are currently closed. So for projects that will occur in 2020 are currently closed. The next intake will be for projects to occur next summer, so 2021. And there is no intake date at this point. I would expect if they are offered, it would be later fall, winter. But kind of this past year, it was the deadline was December. So I would expect something similar to that for next year if the program is offered again.
Okay, great. That's all I have. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I have one more. I'm sorry.
Sure.
So the workshop in Portage, just to clarify from Jewel, it's actually online. So if they could just still call the Portage office at 204-239-3352. Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, that's all right. So yeah, that workshop will be offered through GoToMeeting. So it will be an online workshop, but there are still some spaces available in it. And Tamara in Portage is the one helping us coordinate that. So definitely give her a shout if that would be of interest to you next week.
Well, thank you, everyone. Taya here again. That was fantastic information. I appreciate the questions and the answers. Of course, both Manitoba Agriculture staff and CAP staff are available if you have any additional questions about EFPs, and we'd love to help you with those questions. At this point in time, I'm going to thank Andrea and I'm going to thank Lori for the great information and for setting this up and facilitating today's webinar. And thank you to our audience for coming in and listening. And just to remind you that this has been recorded and you'll have access to it in the future. You will get an email. Thanks to everyone, and I hope you have a good day and enjoy that shining sun and getting out into the fields very soon. Goodbye.